What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Carnage, and in this video, Carnage is gonna kill some gods. So in the last video that we did, which as always, you'll find a link to it down in the description, we basically had Carnage who had returned without Cletus Kasady, meaning it's the symbiote just operating on its own, doing its own thing. And what Carnage desires is power. And so what he had been doing was traveling around and killing different villains for the sake of attaining higher levels of power. What this did is it led to him alongside basically a guy named Neely, right? Ken Neely, who's just kind of obsessed with Carnage and that sort of thing, traveling out into other dimensions, and we end up finding out that the place that they arrived to is Fartelheim, the realm of the Dark Elves. Now, here's the thing. Initially, people scoff at them, and I never understood why. The Dark Elves are ridiculously overpowered, right? It's just one of these crazy things. So when they show up here, right, what's actually taking place is their arrival coincides with the time of what's called the Great Hunt. Now, the way this worked is, for those of you guys who are familiar with like the Thor mythos and all that stuff, you had the War of Realms, right? Like literally all the 9 realms were in the midst of this giant war where they were facing off against Malekith the Accursed and all of his dark elves. That's how powerful these guys were. They were literally conquering entire realities. Like, it's crazy how capable they were. But prior to all of this, one of the things that Malekith did is he basically went and faced off against a kind of a wolf goddess and then stole her cubs. And one of the things that did was sort of elevate his power, but grant him a kind of higher stature. That's one of the things to understand when it comes to like Asgardian gods or any gods associated with the Asgardian mythos. And even when you're talking about characters like Black Panther, it all kind of falls in line with being as much ceremony as it is, attaining a higher level of power. But Malekith, as we know, following the War of Realms, was defeated, and he was basically taken to the realm of Hell, or at least Niflheim, if you want to call it that, but basically taken to Hell, where he's ruled over by Hela and literally held prisoner, right? Like, he's just going to stay there seemingly for all eternity. Now, the Black Bile was kind of like the inner circle of Malekith's forces, the most capable forces that he had, kind of like his, like special operations group, right? Special ops guys. The issue is that after War of Realms, most all the Dark Elves were either defeated or destroyed. So the Black Bile is by and large just what's left of them. And so without a leader and largely feeling kind of just a shade of their former selves, that what they do is they kind of go back and reenact this hunt in order to present themselves, or at least kind of build up their own confidence to a degree. And so what they say, or at least what their leader says, is we need 6 volunteers that can go out there and literally steal the cubs of a wolf goddess, just like Malekith the Accursed did. And by doing that, or successfully doing that, we can re-elevate ourselves, at least in our own eyes, or even the eyes of other people around here, that we are every bit as capable as we were under Malekith. And potentially, we may not even need him. Now, one of the things that I want to specify here, every single one of these dark elves that you see is more than a match for most every superhero on Earth, right? Captain America would just get crushed by one of these dark elves, and it wouldn't even be funny. Thor himself, right, of course, wielding Mjolnir, and especially Thor as he exists now with like the Odin Force or the Thor Force or whatever name you want to put to it, could obviously destroy these guys, right? But what this is going to illustrate here is just exactly how powerful Carnage is, and especially how powerful symbiotes have become over the years in Marvel Comics, ever since the original introduction of Venom back in the 1980s. And so one of the things that goes on here is you do have a guy by the name of Zeist. Now, Zeist is by and large considered the cast-off of the Black Bile. He's there for no other reason than the fact that their forces are so thin, they need every hand on deck. If the Black Bile was back to its, its greatness, right, and had the large number of soldiers that it had before, they wouldn't need this guy. And in fact, they would reject his offer of membership. But truth about it, they need him because there's just so few of them. But what this guy's also been doing on the side is improving himself. Now, we'll talk about that here in a little bit, but one of the things that he addresses right off the bat is, I know you guys don't take me seriously. I'm missing a hand, I've got a crooked spine, nobody here thinks that I'm worthy of being a part of the Black Bile or even this great hunt. But regardless of the circumstance, let me join this, right? And he says, best case scenario, I prove myself to everybody here and you will want me among your ranks because I am one of the most formidable soldiers that you have. I will be the only one out of the 6 who survives this hunt and steals the cubs of a wolf goddess, right? He says, worst case scenario, I die and you get to rid yourself of me. So like, what's there to lose here, right? It's literally win-win. And so ultimately, he's allowed to join the hunt. Now, these guys go out there with the expectation of facing off against a goddess, but instead, they meet Carnage. Now, here's the thing to know. Years and years ago, right, when Venom was first introduced into Marvel Comics, he was just like a little more powerful than Spider-Man, and he could dodge Spider-Man's sense. And like, that's it, right? Like, the spider sense was useless against Venom, and that was like the big thing. But over the years in Marvel Comics, by whatever manner and whatever means, right? Stories and just the evolution of the symbiotes themselves, they've become a lot more powerful. If this was like the 1980s, no way would Carnage, even in the early 1990s when Carnage first officially showed up, no way would he be able to go toe-to-toe with any one of these Dark Elves and stand a chance. But notice this guy toys with them, right? Keeping in mind, any one of these Dark Elves could basically take on virtually any superhero on Earth. That Carnage is just toying with these guys, dancing around them, having a good time, killing them on the spot. Now, Neely is forced to kind of watch all this, but one of the things that he finds so fascinating here is that Carnage literally tells him, your task is to find Zeist, right? This guy here, and kill him, right? That's your job. So literally, he's gonna have to, like, Neely's gonna have to hunt after a god and kill him himself. Now, at this point, we jump back over to John Shade, right? Now, John Shade, of course, was introduced in the last video. He's the cop who's hot on the trail of Carnage. But when Carnage had initially met John Shade and then kind of imbued John Shade with a portion of his own symbiote, right, of the Carnage symbiote, that what John Shade did is he absorbed the memories and the personality of Cletus Kasady, the original Carnage host. And so as a result of that, you have the situation where John Shade and Cletus Kasady are talking to each other in the sense that Cletus is a voice inside of his head. But what's so wild about this is that as they're kind of floating through this ethereal dimension, and the little piece of the Carnage symbiote inside of John Shade is the only thing keeping him from just being crushed by the tidal forces of space and gravity and all that kind of stuff, that it basically leads to him being pulled out of this dimensional plane and into the sphere of the pattern maker. Now, this is where things get really interesting, because now what's happening is we're invoking the Spider-Verse. So we don't really get a whole lot of it here. And in fact, the pattern maker is just kind of the newest iteration of the person who controls the web of life and destiny, right? So a little bit of explanation here. You may find this really, really fascinating. And in fact, I think you will. So the way it works when it comes to spider people is for years and years and years in Marvel Comics, you just had Spider-Man, right? He's a guy who just swung around with webs and fought bad guys and cracked jokes. But over the years, what Marvel's done is they've introduced this much larger mythos. So you know how we have like the Spider-Verse film that's coming out, the newest one, right? Spider-Verse 2. Essentially, the way all of that works, right, using comic books as a kind of baseline, is you have the web of life and destiny. And the web of life and destiny is quite literally a gigantic spider web that exists out there in some other dimension. But the nature of each individual thread of the web is that that's what ties the different spiders together. And the pattern maker herself, right, in this case Annie, by manipulating those threads, is basically kind of able to manipulate reality to a degree, right? So quite literally, she can tug on one thread, and instead of a Peter Parker Spider-Man in another reality becoming Spider-Man, it's like Miles Morales, right? Like, it's just kind of a way to alter reality if they choose to. It's very ambiguous to a degree, and it's very finicky the way that Marvel uses it. Reality warping is a lot easier to understand when you just have a guy who waves his hand and some crazy stuff happens, right? So it's just kind of the nature of comics. But the overall gist of this is that while the destruction of the web of life and destiny doesn't necessarily eradicate every spider in existence, right? Every Spider-Man, Peter Parker, or Spider-Gwen, or Miles Morales, what it does do is it takes away the interconnectivity of all of them, meaning that they are just kind of marginally weaker, right? They're not able to draw off the power of each other across the entirety of the multiverse, because in the end of the day, the web of life and destiny is what connects them all on a kind of spiritual level. And so Annie is basically like the daughter of Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson from an alternate reality. Those of you guys who remember Secret Wars in 2015 and you remember the Renew Your Vows story arc, that Annie, that little girl, this is her. Right now, if you don't know what that means, not a great big huge deal, right? Just a little bit of a fun moment for people who are familiar with that and who remember when we covered Secret Wars 8 years ago. So here's the thing. God, I can't believe I've been doing this for over a decade. It's crazy how long all this has been going on. So what Annie really says here is that because she's the new pattern maker and because she's the one that's tasked with rebuilding the web of life and destiny, she's having a hard time doing it. And the reason why is because every time she tries to reconstruct it, she basically ends up seeing the threads turning into Carnage symbiotes, right? Like just literally the symbiote itself. Now, what this is more symbolic than anything else, but effectively it means that Carnage, right, traveling throughout the various dimensions like this, throughout the universe and even the multiverse, that he is kind of like a free radical. He's not where he's supposed to be. And he's basically disrupting a combination of the flow of time and the natural order of all things in existence. But more so than that, the actions that he's committed to, right, the things that he's engaging in, killing different gods, killing different villains, and so on and so forth, that he's actually affecting the nature of the universe itself. And by gaining greater and greater levels of power, eventually he'll reach a place where he will be unstoppable, and no one across the universe will be able to defeat this guy. And so what we end up doing here is we actually jump away from John Shade, and we jump back to Neely, who's ultimately met by Zeist, who kind of just springs out of nowhere. Now this is where you get this really, really interesting story between the two, because what Zeist really says here is that he and Neely, once Neely kind of reveals his adventure, that he was a guy who's obsessed with just like with attracting Carnage because he loved the kind of destruction and mayhem that Carnage represented, only to find out that once he met Carnage was a lot more dangerous and more sadistic than Neely originally thought, that Carnage has just kind of been making fun of him and just sort of tormenting him the whole time, that Zeist finds a kind of common ground there. Because while Zeist's tormentors somewhat came in the form of other dark elves that just didn't really take him seriously and considered him a cast-off, his greatest tormentor was himself, because he saw himself as less than, both due to his physical handicaps as well as his lack of battle experience. And so what he tells Neely is, he says, unlike you, who basically just sits around moping and just kind of wishing your life could be better, I actually did something about it. And what I did is I just started working on myself, and I started improving myself. I started exercising all the time, like literally building up my weaknesses into physical strengths, right? I became battle hardened, and while I can't wield a broadsword because I lack a second hand to do so, I became prodigious with a dagger. And the truth about this is that if you walk up on an enemy with no broadsword in sight, they're not going to take you seriously. But if you're deadlier with a dagger than anybody could ever be with a broadsword, you'll crush that enemy in the blink of an eye because they'll never see it coming. And that's what's so cool about this, because as this story is being told to Neely, literally Carnage is facing off against these dark elves and just ripping them to pieces. I mean, just tearing their physical bodies apart. I mean, these guys are getting absolutely crushed. And so what ends up happening is Carnage faces off against the last guy, right? He ends up meeting this last guy outside of Zeist, who again is hanging out with Neely. As Carnage encounters this last dark elf, that what Carnage does, realizing the strength and the prowess of this dark elf, is he uses his own symbiotes to conjure manifestations of the other dark elves that he's killed, which is amazing because one, it presents a kind of psychological effect in the sense that this guy's basically being met with people that he knows and is being forced to kill them. But the second thing is it leaves him outnumbered because now it's fighting a variety of symbiotes all at the same time. And so the result of this is that this guy falls pretty quickly. And so following that, like the entire landscape's open and Carnage basically travels to face off against these hellhounds and basically capture them. And so again, as this whole story is being told by Zeist to Neely, and he's kind of spilling the beans about everything, that Neely is faced with a choice. Because what Zeist tells him is he's like, you've got two options here. The first is that we can work together and we can just wait Carnage out. Right, we can literally have him face off, let him face off against all those guys, and either he will kill them, in which case we'll understand how he fights and a way to defeat him, or they will wear him down, and then in turn, even if they don't kill him, he'll still be so weak, we can kill him anyway. But what you have to do, Neely, is you have to make a choice. Are you going to be Carnage's lackey forever? Are you going to be this guy that takes barking orders from Carnage, or do you aspire to be something more? Make your choice. And so what ends up happening is that we just literally jump back to Carnage before we find out what choice Neely made. And as he's talking to Carnage, literally one of the things Neely says is, I don't understand why we're doing all this. Like the previous crimes that you engaged in before, when you seemingly first popped up on the scene and you would like kill people and you would write Carnage rules on the walls in your own blood or in their blood, there was a beauty to it, right? There was a kind of art form to what it was that you were doing. Now it kind of feels indiscriminate. What's the benefit of killing these dark elf gods? What's the benefit of killing these cubs? And literally what Carnage says is, you think that way because you think small, because you live in a small world and you perceive your world in a small way. And he says, I'm thinking much bigger than this. I'm thinking much, much larger than this, right? Stop thinking so small. And he's like, what makes you think that I killed all these hellhounds? These are all a means to an end. I killed all but one, and then I harnessed its power, right? What this does is now it puts me in a position to where I've absorbed the power of all these dark elf gods, right? So now I'm imbued with godly power, and now I've ensnared a hellhound, which will allow me access to get to wherever I want to, specifically to the realm of hell. And so he says, what have you done with regards to the task that I beset you? Did you take out Zeist? And the response of Neely is, yes. That he trusted me all the way until the very last moment, right? He confided in me. He saw me as a kind of kindred spirit. And in that moment, I used his weakness to create his demise. And I slit his throat using the very dagger that he gave me, considering me to be a weaker version of him. And once they actually get to the body, he strung it up, right? This guy is seemingly dead, right? Like literally, he just strung his body up. And when he asked Carnage, why did you have me go after this guy in the first place? The response of Carnage is amazing here. He says, because he was you. Because he was you, right? He was you before, right? The person who was weak, the person who was pathetic. By killing him, you've killed that weak and pathetic version of yourself. You become stronger with every death that you engage in. And so the result of this is that when Neely asks, okay, fine, like, where do we go next? The response of Carnage is the one place that we need a hellhound to get to. And that's when we pick up with John Shade, and we end up finding out that John Shade, after being tasked by Annie with effectively taking out Carnage due to the influence Carnage is having on the very nature of the universe itself, that John Shade is actually teleported to the place that Carnage is going to in order to cut him off at the pass. And the place where Carnage is going is Niflheim, also known as Hell, also known as the realm of Hela, the Asgardian goddess of death herself. And if you guys thought that anything you've seen so far is interesting, it gets nuts after this. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.